All right, let's get into it. And this time, we're going deep, because apparently one pass through human mating history wasn't enough for you people. Respect. Quick question before we start. When you picture a caveman, what do you see? Some grunting guy dragging a club, one woman by his side, maybe a fire, maybe a mammoth steak on the menu? That's the picture pop culture sold us. One man, one woman, forever, since the dawn of time. Monogamy as the default setting of the human species, like it came pre-installed at the factory. Except here's the awkward part. The actual evidence, the bones, the DNA, the anthropology, the stuff scientists dig up and argue about in windowless university basements, tells a story that is way messier, way weirder, and honestly way more interesting than cavemen invented marriage. So today we're answering the question, did ancient humans actually have one partner? And I promise you, the answer is not a simple yes or no. It's more like yes, no. Sometimes depends on the century, depends on the continent, and also depends on how hungry everyone was that year. Let's start with the biology, because your body is basically a walking, talking history book, and it's been leaking secrets about your ancestors' sex lives for millions of years without your permission. Here's the deal. Across the animal kingdom, scientists have a neat trick for guessing how monogamous a species is, just by looking at the size difference between males and females. It's called sexual dimorphism. In species where one male mates with a harem of females, think gorillas, think elephant seals, the males tend to be way bigger than the females. Why? Because if you're a male gorilla and you're competing with other males for exclusive access to a bunch of ladies, you'd better be built like a refrigerator, because you're going to be in fights. Big, muscly, dominant males win, scrawny males lose and go home alone. Forever. Sad, single, and childless. Now compare that to species that mate for life, like gibbons. Male and female gibbons are basically the same size. No harem to fight for, so no evolutionary pressure to be a bodybuilder. Being huge doesn't help you if you're not fighting off 12 other guys for one mate. So where do humans land on this scale? Well, awkwardly in the middle. Human males are on average somewhat bigger than human females, more than gibbons, way less than gorillas, which basically means our ancestors were not fully committed pair bonders like gibbons, but they also weren't running full harem warlord gorilla households either. Biologically, we're built like a species that's kind of monogamous. Sometimes. With exceptions, like a phone plan with fine print. And it gets weirder, because body size isn't the only receipt evolution left behind. There's also, and I promise this is a real scientific field of study, testicle size. Stay with me here. Researchers compare relative testicle size across primates to estimate how much sperm competition a species evolved with. In species where females mate with multiple males in a short window, males evolve larger testes, because it turns out producing more sperm is basically playing the lottery with more tickets. Chimpanzees, notoriously promiscuous, have enormous testes for their body size. Gorillas, who monopolize a harem and don't have to outproduce any rival sperm, have tiny ones relative to their giant bodies, because when you're the only guy in the room, you don't need backup. Humans? Once again, right in the middle, not chimp-level competitive, not gorilla-level exclusive, just comfortably ambiguous. Evolution basically shrugged and said, let's hedge our bets. So already, before we've touched a single fossil or a single historical document, your own body is quietly testifying that ancient humans were not strict, lifelong, one-partner-only monogamists. But they weren't a total free-for-all either. It's somewhere in the middle, which, frankly, tracks with basically every messy relationship decision humans have ever made. There's actually one more biological clue worth mentioning, and it's a hormone called vasopressin. Scientists studied prairie voles, which are famously monogamous little rodents, versus their close cousins, the montane voles, who are basically the opposite. They mate and move on without a second glance. The difference turned out to partly come down to how vasopressin receptors are distributed in the brain. Tweak that receptor pattern, and you can make a normally promiscuous vole start acting weirdly loyal. Humans have similar receptor systems, and some studies have even found links between variations in the human vasopressin receptor gene and differences in relationship stability and pair bonding behavior. So there's a real chance that whether you're the settle down forever type or the why does everyone want me to commit type is in some small part written into a stretch of your DNA that you inherited before you ever went on a single date. Romantic, right? Okay, let's get into what actual early humans and early hominins were doing because this is where things get juicy. Go back around 3 to 4 million years to Australopithecus, one of our early ancestors, the Lucy skeleton crowd. Studies on Australopithecus skeletons show a pretty significant size difference between males and females, bigger than in modern humans. That size gap suggests these early hominins may have lived in a more competitive mating system, closer to today's gorillas than today's humans. Some males were probably outcompeting others for mates rather than everyone pairing off neatly. Fast forward to early Homo species, and something interesting happens. That size gap starts shrinking. By the time you get to early Homo erectus and eventually Homo sapiens, males and females are much closer in size than our earlier ancestors were. And a lot of anthropologists think that shift is connected to a shift in social structure. Less one dominant guy hogs all the mates, more cooperative, pair-bonded, group-living behavior. Why would that happen? One popular theory: human babies are, biologically speaking, a disaster. We are born ridiculously helpless compared to other primates. A baby chimp can cling to its mother's fur within days. A human baby can't even hold its own head up and will happily faceplant into a couch cushion and suffocate if left unsupervised. Human infancy is long, human brains take forever to develop, and raising a human child is, historically, an incredibly resource-intensive project. So the theory goes, pair bonding, or at least long-term cooperative parenting, became an advantage. A mother with a helpless infant benefits enormously from a partner who sticks around to help provide food and protection instead of just contributing genetic material and vanishing into the underbrush. This is sometimes called the provisioning hypothesis, and it's one of the leading explanations for why humans lean toward pair bonding at all, even if it's not always lifelong and even if it's not always exclusive. There's a competing theory, too, worth a quick mention, called the male mate guarding hypothesis. Instead of pair bonding evolving because men wanted to help raise babies, this theory suggests it evolved because men wanted to make sure they were the ones fathering the babies in the first place. In other words, sticking close to one partner wasn't necessarily an act of devotion. It may have started as a paternity insurance policy. Slightly less romantic than the provisioning story, but evolution doesn't really care about romance. It cares about whose genes get passed on. But and this is important, pair bonding is not the same thing as strict monogamy. This is the part where people get tripped up. A pair bond just means two individuals form a preferential, ongoing attachment. It does not necessarily mean sexual exclusivity, and it definitely doesn't mean one partner for your entire life. No exceptions, till death do us part. Plenty of species and plenty of human societies throughout history have had pair bonds with plenty of wiggle room on the side. Which brings us to genetics, because DNA is basically the ultimate snitch. Here's a fun one. Scientists have studied Y chromosome diversity, meaning genetic material passed down specifically through the male line, and compared it to mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line. And around roughly 5 to 7,000 years ago, researchers found something bizarre in the genetic record: a massive bottleneck in Y chromosome diversity. Basically, way fewer men were successfully passing on their genes compared to women during that period. Estimates from some of these studies suggest that for a while, something like one man was reproducing for every 17 women. Let that sink in for a second. That is not monogamous nuclear family math. That is a small number of extremely successful men were fathering a hugely disproportionate share of children math. The leading theory ties this to the rise of early agriculture and the emergence of clan-based, hierarchical, sometimes warlike societies, where a handful of powerful men, chiefs, warlords, dynasty founders, accumulated multiple wives or concubines, while huge numbers of other men were essentially locked out of reproducing at all. So, somewhere around the dawn of farming, Human society took a hard detour away from anything resembling one partner for everyone. If you were an unlucky low-status guy in this era, your odds of finding a partner at all, let alone the one, were brutal. Meanwhile, a small elite were out here basically running polygamous empires. Genghis Khan is the extreme, almost cartoonish example here. Genetic studies have found that a startlingly large number of men across Asia today carry Y chromosome signatures traceable back to a single lineage from around the time of the Mongol Empire. One dynasty, potentially tens of millions of male line descendants scattered across a continent. That's not a guy with a wife. That's a guy with a reproductive strategy that looks more like an empire than a marriage. Now, before this turns into some kind of grim, testosterone-fueled action movie, let's zoom out to actual anthropological data on hunter-gatherer societies, because these groups are often used as rough windows into how humans might have lived for the vast majority of our history. Before agriculture, before cities, before kings. Anthropologists have surveyed hundreds of documented human societies, historical and modern, hunter-gatherer, and otherwise. And the results are genuinely surprising if you grew up assuming monogamy was the universal human default. A large majority of documented societies actually permitted polygyny, meaning one man could have multiple wives, at least under certain conditions, even if most people in those societies practiced monogamy in day-to-day life simply because most men couldn't afford multiple wives, or didn't have the status to attract them. Strict monogamy as the only culturally sanctioned option was actually the minority arrangement across documented human societies. That doesn't mean everyone was running around with 5 spouses. In most polygynous societies, the vast majority of marriages were still monogamous, simply for practical reasons. Supporting multiple wives and their children takes resources most people didn't have. But the cultural door was open in a way that a lot of modern assumptions don't account for. Take groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, who anthropologists have studied for decades precisely because their lifestyle offers some clues about how humans might have lived before agriculture reshaped everything. Hadza relationships tend to be what researchers call serially monogamous. People pair off, stay together for a while, sometimes years, sometimes a lifetime. But breakups and repartnering are common and not particularly stigmatized. There's no dramatic tabloid scandal about it. It's just how relationships work. Compare that to groups like the Himba in Namibia, where extramarital relationships are culturally tolerated to the point that a noticeable percentage of children are, biologically, not fathered by the mother's husband. And it's not treated as some deep betrayal, it's just baked into the social fabric. And it's not just about multiple wives. Some documented societies practiced polyandry, where one woman has multiple husbands, often brothers, particularly in some regions of the Himalayas, historically as a way of keeping family land from getting split up across generations. Then there's the Mosuo of southwestern China, sometimes nicknamed a walking marriage culture, where formal marriage as most of the world understands it barely exists at all. Women can take partners at night without either party moving in together, and children are raised primarily by their mother's extended family, uncles included, rather than by a live-in father. Other societies have had even more fluid, flexible arrangements around sex and partnership that don't map neatly onto modern Western categories of single, married, or cheating at all. So if you're keeping score at home, strict, universal, one partner for life monogamy. Not the ironclad ancient default it's often presented as, but total, chaotic free love with zero pair bonding? Also not accurate. The real picture is a patchwork. Different environments, different resource levels, different social structures, producing wildly different mating and partnership systems across human history and prehistory. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about why this patchwork makes evolutionary sense, because I think this is actually the coolest part of the whole story. Think about it from a resource perspective. In an environment where food is scarce and unpredictable, a man who tries to support multiple wives and their children is spreading himself dangerously thin, and everyone might starve. In that kind of environment, monogamous pair bonding, one man focusing his hunting and gathering efforts on one family, makes a lot more sense. It's basically risk management. But flip the scenario. Imagine a wealthy, resource rich environment or a hierarchical society where certain men have accumulated serious surplus, whether that's cattle, land, or in the modern world, a suspiciously large number of Bitcoin. In that scenario, a high status man can support multiple wives and their children without anyone starving. And from an evolutionary standpoint, if you're a woman choosing between being the sole wife of a poor, low status man or one of several wives of a wealthy, high status man who can actually provide for your children, the math sometimes favors the second option far more than modern romantic sensibilities would like to admit. This is sometimes called the polygyny threshold model, and it's a pretty elegant explanation for why polygynous arrangements pop up again and again throughout human history, specifically correlating with resource inequality. Monogamy tends to correlate with more resource equality across a population. Polygyny tends to correlate with resource concentration in the hands of a few, which, if you squint, sounds suspiciously similar to arguments people still have about modern dating and economics today. Some things never change. We've just swapped the cattle for followers and the harem for a group chat that mysteriously keeps growing. Now, here's a twist that a lot of people don't expect. Agriculture, and later organized religion and law, actually pushed human societies back toward monogamy, at least in a lot of major civilizations. And the reasons are more political than romantic. Some researchers argue that widespread, socially enforced monogamy, meaning laws and religious codes that ban men from taking multiple wives, actually functioned as a kind of social stabilizer. Think about it from the perspective of a society, not an individual. If a handful of wealthy, powerful men are hoarding multiple wives, that leaves a large population of low status, unmarried, reproductively frustrated men running around with nothing to lose. Historically and anthropologically, that is a recipe for instability, crime, and violence. Societies with large numbers of unmarried young men tend to see higher rates of social disruption, more risk-taking, more crime, and even a greater willingness to go to war, since men with a stake in a family and a household tend to have more to lose. So the argument goes that monogamy, especially as it got baked into law and religion in places like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and later Christian and various other legal religious traditions, wasn't purely a romantic ideal about soulmates and true love. It was, at least in part, a pretty effective piece of social engineering. Spread the marriage opportunities more evenly across the male population, reduce the number of angry, mateless young men, reduce social chaos. Sold as sacred, but functioning suspiciously like population-level conflict management. It's worth noting ancient Rome specifically here because it's a great example of monogamy and infidelity coexisting side by side without much contradiction, at least officially. Roman law technically enforced monogamous marriage, one legal wife at a time, while simultaneously treating a married man's affairs with slaves, prostitutes, or lower status partners as completely unremarkable, sometimes even expected, as long as he didn't touch another citizen's wife. So even in one of history's most famous monogamous civilizations, the actual lived reality had a giant asterisk next to it, mostly enforced along lines of power and class rather than universal fidelity, which is a wild thing to sit with. The idea of monogamy as this timeless, sacred, romantic ideal is, in a lot of ways, a relatively recent cultural overlay on top of a much messier evolutionary and anthropological reality. It got moralized. It got wrapped in religious language. It got treated as the natural and correct way to live, but the actual deep history underneath it is way more pragmatic and way less poetic than true love conquers all. And honestly, even today, the data isn't quite as tidy as the wedding industrial complex would like you to believe. Surveys on infidelity in modern monogamous marriages consistently find that a meaningful percentage of people report having cheated at some point. Estimates vary a lot depending on the survey and the country, but it's never zero, and it's never small enough to write off as a rare glitch. And consensual non-monogamy, Open relationships, polyamory, and similar arrangements has been steadily gaining visibility and acceptance in modern surveys, especially among younger generations. None of that means monogamy is fake or pointless. Plenty of people genuinely want it and thrive in it. But it's one more data point suggesting that even now, with all our laws, religions, rom-coms, and Pinterest wedding boards reinforcing the one-partner ideal as hard as culturally possible, human mating behavior still refuses to fit neatly inside the box we built for it. So let's bring it all the way back to the original question. Did ancient humans have one partner? Biologically, humans show signs of a species that evolved some capacity for pair bonding, likely tied to the demands of raising incredibly slow-developing, high-maintenance offspring. That's real, that's in our anatomy, that's in our behavior compared to close primate relatives, and it's even written into our hormone receptors. But strict, universal, lifelong sexual monogamy as some kind of hardwired, non-negotiable human default, the genetic record, the skeletal record, and the anthropological record all say, not really, not consistently, and definitely not for the majority of documented human societies. What we actually see is a species with a flexible mating strategy that shifts depending on environment, resource availability, social hierarchy, and cultural rules that were, frankly, often designed less around romance and more around keeping the peace. Ancient humans didn't have one universal answer to this question, because ancient humans weren't one universal society. They were thousands of different groups, spread across wildly different environments, over hundreds of thousands of years, constantly adapting their social and mating structures to whatever their circumstances demanded. Some were fiercely monogamous. Some were openly polygynous. Some practiced polyandry. Some had walking marriages that don't fit neatly into any modern label at all. If there's one big takeaway here, it's this. The idea that monogamy is simply natural, ancient, and the way humans have always done it is an oversimplification of a genuinely complicated evolutionary and cultural story. And honestly, understanding that complexity doesn't diminish modern relationships or modern monogamy at all, plenty of people build strong, genuinely fulfilling, lifelong partnerships today. And that's real and valid regardless of what our distant ancestors were doing. But it does mean that when someone tells you monogamy is simply hardwired human nature, full stop, end of discussion. The actual evidence says it's a lot more complicated than that, and the caveman with one devoted wife image is more Hollywood than history. And maybe that's actually kind of comforting. Humans have never been one rigid, unchanging thing. We've always been adaptable, flexible, figuring it out as we go, adjusting to whatever environment and society threw at us. Our relationship structures have never been fixed in stone, they've been fixed in circumstance. Which means the way we build relationships today isn't some deviation from a pure ancient template. It's just the latest chapter in a very long, very human habit of making it up as we go along.